Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Unleash the Power of Introversion in Your Team. My name is Caitlin, and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager here at the Myers-Briggs Company. So just to cover a few formalities right in the beginning, today's webinar will run for about 45 minutes. Please feel free to submit questions using the questions box at any time. And if we don't manage to answer all of them during the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards. This webinar is being recorded, so we will send out an email with a link to the recording and the slides within the next few days. So now I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, John Hackston. John is our head of thought leadership and has been with the Myers-Briggs Company for almost 24 years. John is one of the leading authorities in the application of personality type, and his role is vital in keeping the MBTI framework relevant to our ever-changing work environments. He does this through research like he will be presenting today. So I will hand it over to you, John.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Caitlin. Thank you for reminding me how old I am. Now, the title of this webinar today is Unleash the Power of Introversion in Your Team. And there's really a very good reason why we're looking at this today. Because all leaders, well, hopefully all leaders, they want their teams to achieve, to hit their targets or to exceed their targets. And that means that it's really important that the individual members of the team can achieve their full potential. But if you have a team that contains a mix of different people with different personality types, well, that means managers and team leaders need to know how to help all of the team perform well. And that might not always be easy, especially if a team leader has a different personality preferences to their team or to some members of their team. And one of the personality differences you'll often see concerns extroversion and introversion. Because if we look at the population as a whole, the latest data we have suggests that in the US general population, there's actually rather more introverts than extroverts. Just 43% with extroversion personality preferences and 57% with introversion. Now, it may not always seem that way because extroverts, as we'll see, do tend to make more noise, but that's what the numbers say. But if we look at managers, well, for first level managers, that's towards the bottom of this chart, then just over half, 52% are extroverts. And as we go to more senior levels, the proportion of extroverts just increases. The top level executives, then 62% are extroverts. Now, looking at this data, there's a whole load of questions that you could ask. But here's two just to start thinking about. First of all, why is it that leaders are more likely to have extroversion personality preferences? And secondly, how can those extroverted leaders manage and motivate the introverts in their team? And part of the answer to both of those questions might lie in looking at what extroversion and introversion actually are. But first, let's understand a little bit of some of the misconceptions that are out there around introversion and about introverts. Because introversion quite often gets rather a bad press. There seems to be at least some bias against introversion in Western society in general, and perhaps in some organizations in particular. Here are some of the things that people may sometimes say about introverts when perhaps they're feeling a little, let's say, uncharitable. Perhaps these introverts haven't got any friends. They're shy. They're lonely. In fact, they're actually quite antisocial. They are a bit distant. They don't seem interested in what I'm saying. I do sometimes wonder if they're not very clever. They're a bit slow in the uptake. They're a bit boring. but not fun to have around. Now we're going to resolve some of the truth behind these misconceptions a little bit later. But first of all, during this webinar, I'm going to ask you a few questions, some polls. I'm going to launch the first one now. Do you feel under more pressure to behave like an extrovert or like an introvert? So which of those statements is most true of you? I definitely feel pressure to behave like an extrovert. On balance, there's some pressure on me to behave like an extrovert. On balance, there's some pressure on me to behave like an introvert. Or I definitely feel pressure to behave like an introvert. So let me just give you a little while to answer those polls. So just over half of you have voted. So keep those votes coming in. When we get to around about 3/4 of you, we'll close the poll and see what your results are. Okay. So it looks as if so far around about 2/3 of you feel there's some pressure on you to behave like an extrovert, and just under 1/4 definitely pressure to behave like an extrovert, and only about 11% pressure to behave like an introvert. Let me just share those results with you now. So 23% definitely feel pressure to behave like an extrovert, 66% some pressure, and only 11% some or definitely, or only 1% definitely feel pressure to behave like an introvert. So on balance, for all of you in this group, it looks like there's more pressure to behave in an extroverted way. And this question we asked you, we also asked a similar question to a large group of people who knew their personality type. We asked them, do you feel more pressure to behave in an extroverted way or in an introverted way? And they were actually even more emphatic about those pressures on themselves. 92% said that they felt more pressure to behave in an extroverted way. And perhaps that isn't surprising, given some of those stereotypes that we just heard. But here's the thing. Perhaps it's quite useful to have introverts around. For example, do teams which are diverse in terms of extraversion and introversion, do those teams actually perform better or worse than more homogenous teams? From what you already know, let me just ask you to think to yourselves, do you think diverse teams perform better? Because if you look at the research evidence, the answer is not necessarily. That might be a surprise, because many of you have probably heard that diverse teams actually perform better. And actually, a lot of the time, diverse teams do perform better. So let's look at the detail behind this. Here is where more homogeneous, where less diverse teams can often, but not always, but often, actually perform better. Where teams really are implementing things that are already known about, where there's set processes, where things are simple and straightforward, where there's very little, if any, uncertainty, ambiguity, and when things are very much in a steady state, when things are staying the same. If those things are in place, then actually more homogeneous teams can perform better. But where diverse teams perform better, or where the team needs to be innovative, creative, or do new things, where actually new processes are needed because the existing set processes can't cope with these new situations, where the tasks that people need to carry out require complex responses, and where there is at least some, or perhaps much, uncertainty and ambiguity around, and where things are changing. So the question I'd ask you to think about is, looking at those two lists, which of those is closer to the environment that your teams work in? For most of you, quite possibly all of you, I suspect that the right-hand column is probably much closer to what you need. Perhaps actually, especially right now, with everything else going on. But that was probably the case even before issues like COVID, for example, came along. Now, in those more uncertain, more ambiguous situations, whatever they are, the research does show that more diverse teams, they do tend to take longer to make decisions, but that they then go on to make more rounded, better decisions. The research also says that more diverse teams can have more conflict, but generally speaking, teams that have a mix of extroverts and introverts do perform better than teams which are only composed of extroverts or only composed of introverts. So to avoid conflict and get the best out of their teams, it's important that managers understand both extroversion and introversion and how to work with and manage extroverts and introverts. So let's go on there to look at what introversion and extroversion actually are. And the good news about some of those stereotypes we saw before about introverts is that none of them are entirely true and several are just plain wrong. And we'll be using the approach to extroversion and introversion taken by the MBTI assessment, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. As I talk through what E&I, extroversion and introversion are all about, you might want to think about whether you feel you have preferences yourself for extroversion or for introversion. Now, the core, the essence of extroversion and introversion is about energy and about focus. Extroverts get their energy from and focus their attention on the outside world of people and things. That's why the arrows around that orange circle around the letter E are going to and from the outside world. Introverts get their energy from and focus their attention on their inner world of thoughts and feelings. That's why the arrows on that right-hand picture are on the inside. So much for the big picture, but what does that actually imply for people's behavior? What do extroverts or introverts actually do? Well, extroverts, for example, tend to act before they think. They'll tend to do stuff, then think about it, then do some more stuff. Whereas introverts tend to think first, then they do something, and then they think about it again. And that tends to mean that extroverts prefer to get into action quite quickly. Whereas introverts typically prefer to spend some time reflecting things through before they get into action. So extroverts can get a little impatient with introverts from time to time. Introverts feel they're a little rushed from time to time. Extroverts tend to talk things through. Introverts tend to think things through. So if we think back to those heady, wonderful times before COVID came along, we're all in lockdown, and we might be working with colleagues and go out to buy a sandwich at lunchtime together. When the extrovert walked in the sandwich shop, you might hear something like, "I wonder what I shall have today." They seem to have, they got pastrami and banana as a special today. That's a weird sandwich. I'm not sure I fancy pastrami and banana. What shall I have today? I wonder. I haven't had cheese for a while. Perhaps I'll just have something like a cheese salad. Yeah, I'll have a cheese salad. I'll have a cheese salad, please. The introvert walks into the same sandwich store, and what you'll hear from them is, "Have a cheese sandwich, please." The point is, actually exactly the same thought process has gone through from the introvert about the pastrami banana, about what they've had, etc. But for the introvert, all that conversation is going on inside their head. For the extrovert, you're hearing it in the outside world. Extroverts tend to be more expressive when interacting, introverts more contained. A few years ago, we collaborated with a TV station on a program about psychological type, about personality type. And one of the things we did was to put people in a soundproof room, and we could look through a window of them talking to somebody else. And you could actually recognize the extroverts or the introverts just by the body language. Extroverts wave their arms around more, they were generally more expressive, introverts more contained. Extroverts get energy from interacting with people in the outside world. Introverts need time to themselves to recharge their batteries and get back energy from concentration. And extroverts tend to have a breadth of interest. They may be interested in lots of different things or hobbies. They may pick up one thing, put something else down, lots of things on the go. Introverts tend to have a breadth of interest. There are fewer interests than they have. But if you get an introvert talking on the right subject, there's a lot of information there. You might even think you're talking to someone with an extroverted preference. So there's nothing in here about dominance or social confidence, and extroverts aren't necessarily more confident or dominant than introverts, but sometimes it can seem that way. Let's take what might happen in meetings, for example. In a meeting, extroverts do sometimes seem to be vying for attention with each other. They're often happy to talk over each other. Maybe everybody's talking at once. And it isn't, as far as they're concerned, about being rude or about cutting people off. It's just that as things come into your head, you say that out loud because talking things through is just what you do. So this picture we have here may be a slight exaggeration, but hopefully you get the idea. Introverts talk less, but when they do say something, it's usually the end point of a long train of thought. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the things they come up with are gems, or really worthwhile contributions to the meeting. But the danger is that what they say then becomes lost in the melee of the conversation amongst all those extroverts. Those important gems are missed. And this can be frustrating for the introvert and detrimental also to the purpose of a meeting. Take a look at the guy at the right-hand side of the picture. Is he engaged, but deep in thought, or is he disengaged? Extroverts may see introverts as disinterested and perhaps go on to ignore them. So in this meeting, it might be that people are disengaged, their minds are elsewhere, or there could be some quite deep thinking going on. All manner of exciting stuff might actually be going on inside an introvert's head, waiting to be talked about in a meeting if only they have the opportunity to get it out there and express it. So in meetings, do allow time for introverts to think and respond. And when they do say something, listen is probably the end product of a lot of thinking. Of course, that does not guarantee that it is a good idea, but it might be. And while individuals will vary, it's generally a good idea, if possible, to let people receive the agenda and any other information before a meeting so they can have a chance to think about it beforehand. And also to give people a chance afterwards to think about what was discussed and then come back to you with any questions or new ideas. Of course, at the moment, most of us are meeting remotely using Zoom or Skype or Teams or the other app of your choice. And that can make it quite difficult to figure out what's going on. Take a look at these 6 people, for example. Some of them seem to be pretty involved in the meeting, others much less so. But this could be misleading. Extroverts can dominate a remote meeting just as much as they can dominate a face-to-face session. Perhaps sometimes even more so, as remote sessions are for many people newer, and meeting etiquette might be less clear. Look at the guy at the top left, for example. He may be disengaged from a meeting, or you may be looking at some notes he's taken down with ideas that could be really useful and move the meeting on. Introverts may jot down notes as they talk, as they think things over, so it might help to give him a gentle prompt without putting him on the spot to ask him to share his ideas when he's ready. And don't forget also to keep an eye on the chat box. Some introvert participants might prefer to write down their thoughts there. In larger meetings, you might even have someone to monitor the chat box for you. And on platforms like Zoom, with different views available, use a gallery view rather than a speaker view, so that as far as possible you can see everyone and recognize when people are trying to contribute but seem not to be able to get a word in. Keep an eye out for people when people come off mute but don't seem to then talk, for example. Now, all of this is going to continue to be important because for many of us, remote working is here to stay. Even after the pandemic is over, and that may be a while yet, remote working is going to be attractive for organizations for financial reasons, and to many people who want to reduce their commuting time, increase the time they spend with family and friends, and just generally taking advantage of the things that home working can give them. So those remote meetings will continue on for some time. We actually recently carried out a piece of research where we asked people who knew their MBTI personality type about their feelings about the COVID pandemic and about their views on remote working. One question we asked people, you can see at the bottom of the screen at the moment, we asked this question of people who weren't working remotely, people who were still in a regular workplace location. I would have preferred to be able to work remotely. And as you can see from the key at the bottom of the slide, we had a chance of answering that question with strongly disagree, disagree, agree, or strongly agree. Now, extroverts were, on balance, likely to disagree with that question. Only a third of extroverts, 33%, agreed or strongly agreed, compared with just over half, 53% of introverts. But when we looked at people who were already working remotely, there's actually very little difference between extroverts and introverts. Only a few more extroverts than introverts agreed with, I wish I did not have to work from home. And over 3/4 of extroverts would like to keep on working from home after quarantine ends. Slightly less of a percentage of introverts, true, but still a majority. The details of our research show that on balance, extroverts are missing having people around in a way that's not the case of introverts, but that there are nevertheless several aspects of working from home that they do enjoy. So it's likely that for many of us, many of our teams, whether they have preferences for extroversion or introversion, those people are likely to be working remotely for some time to come. Now, different aspects of working remotely can be stressful to extroverts and different aspects stressful to introverts. In more normal times, let's say, extroverts will tend to find it stressful if they have to spend too much time alone, introverts if they can't get any time alone. But these are some of the things that each type might find stressful where we are at the moment in lockdown or in similar situations. So for extroverts, they'll tend to be stressed by the fact there aren't people around. There's just not the people around, or perhaps they're entirely on their own in their house. Things are too quiet. There's no stimulation in a home environment. Things aren't busy enough as regards people and as regards things, as regards just the stimulation from their five senses. They can't socialize and they can't travel. Whereas for people with passive introversion, if they have to work in a noisy environment, it might be normally they can work in a quiet environment, perhaps at work or perhaps in their own office, but perhaps now they have kids around. Or perhaps they're sharing a house, they have noisy housemates. Having too many online meetings can be stressful for anybody, but especially for introverts if they don't have the chance to spend some time recharging their batteries in between. Other people's expectations. Introverts still need some contact with other people, and if people expect them not to need any contact at all and don't contact them, that can be stressful in itself. And the possibility, especially if they are really quite enjoying working from home or many aspects of working from home, but in the future when things change, they'll have to go back and work in office full time, they won't be able to work from home in the future. Now, when an extrovert begins to become stressed, they'll generally get louder and more extreme in their behavior, But an introvert will tend to get quieter and quieter and quieter. So do be aware if one of your team appears to be even quieter than they usually are. Now, one thing that we said we would do in this webcast was to look at how to access and use the extroverted side of every introvert. And to see what that means, we need to talk a little bit about all the aspects of your personality type, not just extroversion and introversion. But before I do that, let's just see how many of you know already quite a bit about the MBTI personality framework. So I've just launched a poll which asks you about how familiar you are with the MBTI framework. It may be that you're already an MBTI practitioner and use it often. It might be that you're qualified to use the questionnaire but have not used it. Maybe you received feedback but haven't actually trained how to use the questionnaire. Perhaps you've heard of the MBTI but have not had a chance to have feedback. And a few of you, no one so far, but let's see, 1% of you so far are saying, what is the MBTI? So let me just give you a moment to answer that poll, and when about 3/4 you've answered, we'll share the results. So just a few more moments. Okay, let's close the polling now and share the results. So over half of you are qualified to use the MBTI. 37% of you are practitioners, but a good proportion have received feedback but may not know as much as others, and some of you know very little about the MBTI. So with my apologies to those of you who already know the MBTI back to front, I'm just going to briefly go through a little bit about what the MBTI approach and framework is all about. So at its base, the Myers-Briggs type indicator model looks at 4 areas of personality. It looks at an extraversion, introversion, and as we've already seen, that's about where you get your energy from and where you focus your attention. It looks also at sensing and intuition. If you have preferences for sensing, you prefer information and you prefer to use information which is real, which is actual, which is practical, which is based on the information coming through from your 5 senses, hence the word sensing, or from your detailed memory of things that have happened to you in the past. Whereas if you have preferences for intuition, you prefer information which is about the big picture, about how things connect together, about where things are going to in the future, rather than perhaps what things were like in the past. Thinking and feeling is about how we prefer to make decisions. People with a thinking preference prefer to make decisions on the basis of objective logic. People with a feeling preference prefer to make decisions on the basis of their values and perhaps wider values, and on the basis of how those decisions will affect people. And judging and perceiving is about your lifestyle, how you deal with the world around you. People with a preference for judging prefer to live their lives in a more structured, organized way. People with a preference for perceiving prefer to live their lives in a more open, spontaneous, unplanned way. So any one individual by this theme would have preference for either extroversion or introversion, sensing or intuition, thinking or feeling, judging or perceiving, and those combine together to give one of 16 possible types. So for example, if someone had preferences for introversion, for sensing, for thinking, and for judging, we say their overall personality type preferences were ISTJ, the responsible realist. Hopefully that makes sense to those who haven't come across the MBTI before, and hopefully it was at least something of a refresher for those of you who have. So we aren't just extroverts or introverts, we are a combination of all of those aspects of our personality. Now, so far we've been talking about extroversion and introversion and extroverts and introverts as if they're 2 separate species. And of course, that isn't really what goes on. In fact, I shouldn't really be talking about extroverts or introverts at all. I should be saying people for preference for extroversion and people for preference for introversion, because just as you'll tend to sign your name when you have to sign things with the same hand every time, we'll have a preference to do most things either in an extrovert way or an introvert way. But just as we might use our non-preferred hand for some tasks, we'll sometimes use the non-preferred side of our personality. We all have an extroverted side and an introverted side, things we'll tend to do out there and things we'll tend to do in here, inside our heads. And this applies to some of those aspects of personality that we mentioned on the previous slide. Sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling. Some of these functions we'll do inside our heads, and it may be less obvious to other people what we're doing. Some we do out there in the external world, and that tends to be more obvious to other people. Pardon me. Extroverts will spend more time doing things out there, but there will still be some things that we do inside their heads. For introverts, the way round. If we recognize that in ourselves, it helps to understand ourselves. And if we recognize that's the case of other people, it helps us to understand other people, including our teams. We're going to send you more information on these ideas after this webcast. But first, let's look at an example of how this works to try and bring it to life a little bit. In a short while, I'm going to ask you whether you see yourselves as extroverted or introverted, and how others see you. But before that, let's look at an example. I'm going to use the example of someone I know very well, myself. So here I am, I'm looking quite happy, which is nice. Probably because this picture was taken when I was actually sitting in a restaurant, back in 2019 when you could do that sort of thing. Now, I have preferences for introversion. I'm an introvert. For those of you who know about the MBTI, my full type preferences are INTP. Introversion, intuition, thinking, and perceiving. As an introvert, when given a chance, I'm very happy spending time by myself inside my own head. And what I especially tend to do there is a process of thinking, introverted thinking, what's sometimes called the analyst. But because this is all going on inside, I do sometimes forget to tell people I've made that decision. Even somehow assume that they just know what I've decided somehow. And I'm sure when you ask my partner about this, she could give you plenty of examples of this. Although no amount of time has helped me not to do it quite so often. And when I do remember to tell people of a decision, they may sometimes ask questions about if I'm feeling a little uncharitable, I may think I'm actually a little bit stupid. But that's because they aren't aware of the chain of reasoning I've gone through to get there, and I'm forgetting that they haven't seen it because that word inside my head is so vivid to me. They don't see that chain of reasoning. What they do see is a part of me that I'll tend to do on the outside, a part of me that I extrovert, and for me that's intuition. Extrovert intuition, the explorer. Exploring possibilities, exchanging ideas. So although I'm an introvert, I really enjoy brainstorming, for example. So if I need to be creative, it's good for me to do this with other people. When I need to make a decision or solve a logical problem, it's good for me to do this on my own. I actually discovered this back in school, although I didn't have the framework then to really make sense of it. If I was doing my physics or maths homework, I just put my head down and did it. And sometimes I had to remember to go back and show my workings out, as I might have done several of those steps inside my head. If I do some creative writing, I need to get up, walk around my bedroom, look out the window, just to get some contact with the outside world. So, thinking about that, I'd like you to think a little bit about how you see yourselves. Are you an extrovert, do you believe, and people always see you as an extrovert? Or perhaps you think you're an extrovert, but people sometimes see you as an introvert? Or an introvert, but sometimes see as an extrovert, or an introvert, and yeah, you're definitely seen as an introvert. I'll just give you everyone a chance to vote. I'm conscious, by the way, we're getting near the end of our time together, but we might go on a few minutes after our appointed time, perhaps 50 minutes rather than 45, just to make sure we cover all the content. Okay, I was going to close the poll there. Close that out. And share the results. One thing I noticed when people were filling in the poll, interestingly, was that initially the numbers were much more in favour of extroversion, which suggests that the extroverts jumped in and did stuff first, while the introverts thought a little bit about it. But now we have a condition in this room where quite a few people, the majority, believe they're introverts, but actually nearly half of this group, 46%, believe an introvert, but sometimes you're seen as an extrovert. And that might reflect perhaps the way that introverts sometimes need to operate in organizations. So hopefully that's given a little bit of a picture of how extroversion and introversion could work, and how even extroverts do some things inside, even introverts do some things outside, and perhaps it's those aspects of people, of introverts, which are more readily seen. So we've covered a fair amount of ground today, but how can we use this information to take the title of this session, Unleash Your Power of Introversion? For introverts like me, how do we make our mark? And for individual extroverts, for team leaders, for managers, for organizations, what can be done to make the best use of us introverts as a resource? Well, here are some ideas, a 7-point plan, if you will. First of all, allow time to thinking. If you yourself are an introvert, do allow yourself time to think before feeling pressured to jump in and answer a question. If you're an extrovert, don't expect the best introvert answer straight away. Allow them time to answer. If you ask a question to a group and don't get an immediate answer, but if you're an extrovert, then make yourself count to at least 5 slowly before you start prompting the group for an answer. Counting to 10 is probably better. And if you're an introvert, only count to 5 before you follow up. And I think this applies whether you're talking about a face-to-face session or a virtual meeting. In a virtual meeting, in fact, if you're facilitating that session, you may need to remind some participants just to remain quiet for a moment while you listen fully to what someone else has to say. Listen. When an introvert makes a suggestion, listen to them. This suggestion is probably the end of a long process of thinking, and if you really want to annoy or demotivate an introvert, and hopefully you don't, but if you do, then just brush that idea aside and avoid taking it seriously. Consider communication channels. Think about how you communicate. It isn't necessarily the case that introverts want everything written down, although some may really appreciate this. For some introverts, one-to-one meetings can work well, but group meetings tend not to be so good. And there are differences now. Extroverts and introverts use different types of communication channels, such as email as well. We're going to send you a guide to personality type an email after this webcast, amongst various other things. Remember that our own natural tendency to be communicating the way that works for us, and this may not be what our audience or what individual team members actually need from us. Interruptions. One thing that extroverts sometimes do to introverts is to disrupt their chain of thought. An extrovert asks a question, the introvert starts thinking through and formulating their answer. The extrovert thinks, this has taken a while, perhaps I wasn't clear enough, and asks a follow-up question or tries to clarify that question, which is confusing because the introvert is still trying to get the right answer to the first question. And you get into a bit of a tennis match where no one is satisfied. So try not to interrupt people if they seem to be thinking through their answer. Allow people me time to recharge their batteries. Sometimes introverts can seem, perhaps at a social event, for example, the life and soul of the party for a while, but then seem to vanish. They actually may need some me time to go away by themselves, recharge their batteries before they can re-engage with what's going on. In a work context, having virtual meeting after virtual meeting without a break, that can be hard on anyone, but tends to be particularly hard on introverts. Give people some time to recharge their batteries. Remember that we all have both an introverted side and an extroverted side. as we've outlined, we both have both sides. Learn what works for you, where it's good for you to use introversion, where it's good for you to use extroversion, and talk to your team to see what works for them. Remember, depending on the context that you see people in, it may be their extroverted side or their introverted side that's actually more obvious to you. And last but not least, think about the iceberg. Because you only see or hear what an introvert does or says, but there's an awful lot more stuff going on under the surface. So thank you for your time today. My apologies for going a little over my allotted time. I'm going to take you back over now to Caitlin, who will take you through some possible next steps that you might want to pursue. Over to you, Caitlin.
Thanks, John. So John has presented some really valuable information for individuals as well as for team leaders. And for team leaders, it's important to note that the key strategies and takeaways talked about here are enhanced with the knowledge of the MBTI for yourself as well as for your team members. And we have a few ways to help you do that. So to start, we have a low-cost, high-impact virtual workshop during which one of our experts will take your team through the MBTI, and there are options for add-on focuses of building resilience, managing change, and enhancing communication. You also have the option to certify someone in your organization to facilitate these workshops and sessions, providing that essential information that team leaders need to know. And finally, our new self-directed, self-paced virtual option, MBTI Online Teams. This allows your team to go through the MBTI and additional learning modules with no scheduling delays and at your own pace. And every situation and organization is unique. And as the experts in people development, we'd love to partner with you and help the teams in your organization utilize these strategies. And we know working right now looks a little different, and we're focusing on team function with this page on the screen with the URL, and this is dedicated to resources to help give your team the boost that they need. And we'll be sending this link out along with the slides and some of the other resources that John mentioned earlier. So unfortunately, we are right up against the time, so we do not have time for questions, but I do see a few in there. So we will be following up with you if you asked a question directly via email and with the follow-up assets as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.